What if I told you the person you're destined to love hasn't caught up to your age yet, but has already caught up to your soul? Not physically, not socially, but in a way that feels almost impossible to explain. Because sometimes the one who loves you the deepest doesn't match your timeline, but matches your inner wound. And that mismatch, it's not confusion, it's recognition. Have you ever met someone and felt strangely responsible for them? Not in a parental way, not in a friendly way, but in a pull that feels older than logic. You try to explain it. They're younger. This shouldn't feel this intense. But your mind argues, while something deeper stays silent. Because the connection isn't happening between two ages. It's happening between two unconscious worlds. Attraction beyond age is rarely about the number itself. It is about what the number represents in the mind. When someone feels drawn to a person significantly younger or older, the unconscious is not calculating years. It is responding to psychological energy, emotional signals, and internal unmet needs. The conscious mind quickly labels the situation as unusual or wrong because it relies on social structure and logic, but attraction does not originate from that layer. It comes from a deeper layer where time is not measured linearly. Often, what we call age difference attraction is actually a response to emotional contrast. A younger person may carry openness, spontaneity, or emotional immediacy that feels refreshing to someone who has become structured, guarded, or mentally overdeveloped through experience. The older person may, in turn, carry stability, emotional containment, or a sense of direction that feels grounding to someone still forming their identity. The pull happens because each unconsciously senses a missing quality in themselves being expressed by the other. But this is where the mind misinterprets the signal. It translates psychological attraction into physical or chronological terms because that is easier to understand. So instead of recognizing, I am drawn to their emotional state, it becomes, I am drawn to their age group, even though age is only the surface container. Another layer beneath this is projection. The unconscious often places parts of the self that have been neglected, suppressed, or undeveloped onto another person. A younger individual can become a symbolic space where lost vitality, innocence, or emotional honesty is re-experienced. Similarly, the older individual can become a symbolic figure of wisdom, safety, or emotional clarity. The attraction intensifies because it feels like recognition, as if something long forgotten has been found again outside the self. However, this kind of attraction is not stable if it remains unconscious. If both individuals do not recognize what is actually being mirrored, the relationship can become imbalanced, idealized, or confusing. One person may feel ahead while the other feels behind, when in reality, both are being invited to integrate different parts of themselves. The age gap becomes meaningful only when it is mistaken for the source of connection instead of what it truly is, a symbolic expression of inner psychological differences seeking resolution through encounter. The unconscious is not guided by logic, social rules, or deliberate intention. It operates through patterns, memories, emotional imprints, and symbolic associations that were formed long before conscious reasoning became dominant. When it is drawn to something that feels familiar, it is not necessarily reacting to something it has literally experienced in the external world, but to something that resembles an internal emotional pattern. Familiarity in this sense is psychological recognition, not factual memory. This is why a person can meet someone new and still feel an immediate sense of, I know this person, without having any prior contact. The unconscious compares present experience with internal emotional templates shaped by childhood dynamics, past relationships, unmet needs, and even inherited relational patterns. If someone's presence resonates with an unfinished emotional story inside the psyche, attraction is activated before conscious evaluation can intervene. What feels like destiny or sudden deep connection is often this recognition process occurring beneath awareness. The unconscious does not ask whether a person is appropriate, available, or logically compatible. It asks whether the emotional tone of the person fits a pre-existing inner pattern. If it does, the nervous system responds with intensity, attention, and emotional focus, often before any rational understanding is formed. This mechanism can also explain why people sometimes repeat similar relationship experiences with different individuals. The external figures change, but the internal pattern remains constant. The unconscious keeps seeking familiar emotional environments because familiarity feels safe, even when it is not healthy. It prefers repetition over uncertainty because repetition is predictable, and predictability reduces inner psychological tension. In deeper layers, familiarity is not only about comfort, but also about unfinished emotional resolution. If a certain emotional state was never fully integrated, the unconscious may repeatedly seek situations that recreate it, hoping for a different outcome. So when someone feels strangely drawn to a person, it may be because that person unconsciously activates both recognition and the possibility of completing something unresolved within the self. The conscious mind often mistakes this for external destiny because it experiences the intensity without seeing the internal structure behind it. But what is actually happening is an inner map responding to echoes of itself, selecting connections that feel known even when they are entirely new in form and circumstance. Projection is one of the most subtle forces in human attraction because it makes what is internal appear external. Instead of seeing a person as they are, the mind overlays them with emotional meanings, memories, and unmet aspects of the self. This does not happen intentionally. It is an automatic function of the psyche that tries to complete its own missing parts by recognizing them in other people. When someone feels intensely drawn to another, part of that intensity is often not about the other person's actual qualities, but about what they represent internally. What makes projection powerful is that it feels like clarity. The mind experiences it as certainty. This person is special, or this person understands me in a way no one else does. But what is actually being recognized is not full understanding of the other, but resonance with something unacknowledged within the self. The other person becomes a symbolic surface where inner qualities are reflected back in an external form that feels alive. In many cases, projection involves disowned or underdeveloped aspects of identity. If someone has suppressed their emotional vulnerability, they may project softness and emotional openness onto another person. If they have suppressed confidence or direction, they may see those traits amplified in someone else. The attraction grows because the mind is not simply admiring the other person. It is encountering parts of itself that were never fully integrated. This is why projection can create both fascination and distortion at the same time. The fascination comes from recognition, while the distortion comes from misattribution. The person feels deeply meaningful, but the meaning is partly constructed by the observer's internal world. As a result, the emotional bond can feel larger than reality because it is fueled by internal longing rather than external accuracy. Projection also explains why relationships can feel transformative in their early stages. Meeting someone who carries projected qualities can temporarily expand one's sense of self, as if dormant aspects are suddenly awakened. However, if projection is not gradually withdrawn through awareness, confusion begins. The real person and the projected image start to diverge, creating emotional tension. At its core, projection is the psyche's attempt to make the invisible visible. It uses other people as mirrors to reveal what has not yet been consciously owned. The intensity of attraction, therefore, often points less to who the other person truly is and more to what the mind is still trying to recognize within itself. Love, feeling like recognition of something already known, is rooted in how the psyche organizes experience through memory that is not always personal or linear. When two people meet and experience an immediate sense of familiarity, it is often because the emotional tone of the interaction matches something already stored within the inner world. This already known feeling does not necessarily come from a specific past encounter with that person, but from an internal pattern that has been shaped over time through emotional relationships, formative experiences, and deep psychological impressions. The mind does not store emotional experience as isolated events. It stores them as relational templates. These templates include how it felt to be seen, ignored, valued, misunderstood, or emotionally held. When someone new enters life and unconsciously activates one of these templates, the response is not analytical, but immediate. The nervous system reacts as if it has encountered something meaningful before, even though the external situation is new. This is why love can feel like recognition rather than discovery. Discovery implies something entirely new, but recognition implies continuity with something already existing inside. The feeling is often described as, "I know you," even when there is no factual basis for that knowledge. What is being recognized is not the person as they are in totality, but the emotional configuration they awaken within the observer. This sense of familiarity can also create a powerful illusion of depth early in connection. Because the inner world is being activated, the emotional response feels larger than the actual interaction. The mind interprets intensity as truth, assuming that strong feeling must mean deep external compatibility. But intensity alone is not evidence of external reality. It is often evidence of internal activation. At a deeper level, recognition in love is tied to the psyche's drive toward wholeness. When someone mirrors an inner state that has been fragmented or forgotten, the encounter feels like returning to something lost. This return creates emotional relief, which the mind interprets as love. However, what is being experienced is often the relief of internal alignment rather than the objective presence of another person. Over time, if awareness is present, this recognition can evolve. The initial feeling of "I already know you" can shift into a more grounded understanding of "I am seeing myself reflected through you." But without that awareness, recognition can harden into idealization, where the sense of familiarity replaces the need to truly know the other person as they are in their full complexity. If this idea is making you question someone in your life, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this attraction feeding my ego or expanding my awareness? Because the difference between obsession and meaning is whether you are being pulled backward into fantasy or forward into growth. One of you carries experience, the other carries raw emotional truth, and somehow, both recognize what the other is missing. An age difference in connection often appears on the surface as a mismatch in years, but psychologically it usually represents a difference in inner development rather than time lived. The psyche does not mature evenly across all areas. A person may be emotionally advanced but socially uncertain, or intellectually sharp but emotionally underdeveloped. So when two individuals with different ages feel strongly drawn to each other, what is often interacting is not chronological age, but contrasting layers of psychological maturity. One person may have developed structure, discipline, and emotional containment through experience, while also losing a sense of immediacy or emotional openness along the way. The other may still carry raw emotional intensity, spontaneity, and vulnerability, but lack refinement in emotional regulation or long-term orientation. When these two meet, each encounters a missing aspect of themselves reflected in the other, creating a sense of complementarity that feels magnetic. This is where the illusion of older versus younger becomes misleading. The attraction is not truly about who came earlier or later in life, but about who has developed which inner functions. Emotional maturity, for example, does not always increase with age. It develops through reflection, suffering, awareness, and integration. Similarly, emotional openness is not exclusive to youth. It can exist in anyone who has not hardened their inner world. Because of this uneven development, an age gap can symbolically represent a psychological gap. One person may embody stability and direction, while the other embodies vitality and emotional immediacy. The attraction arises because each experiences the other as carrying something they lack or have lost. This creates a sense of wholeness through contrast, not similarity. However, the mind tends to interpret this psychological contrast in literal terms. It assumes that the difference in feeling must be explained by difference in age, when in reality age is only the visible container. The deeper dynamic is about inner structure, not time. This misunderstanding can lead to confusion, where individuals believe they are attracted to youth or maturity, when they are actually responding to emotional qualities that have been separated within themselves. When this recognition remains unconscious, it can create imbalance, with one person feeling like a guide and the other feeling like a seeker. But when it becomes conscious, the age difference loses symbolic weight, and what remains is the opportunity for both individuals to integrate those missing psychological qualities within themselves, reducing dependence on the other as the sole carrier of what is needed for inner completion. What feels like fate in human connection is often the experience of two unconscious patterns colliding in a way that creates emotional intensity and meaning. The mind tends to interpret strong emotional impact as evidence of external destiny because it cannot immediately see the internal mechanisms producing that experience. When two people meet and feel an unusual pull, synchronicity, or emotional acceleration, it is often because each is activating a specific psychological pattern in the other that was already waiting to be triggered. These patterns are not random. They are formed through earlier relational experiences, emotional wounds, unmet needs, and deeply internalized expectations about love and connection. When someone enters life whose presence matches the structure of one of these patterns, the encounter feels significant, almost orchestrated. The psyche experiences it as meant to be, because it recognizes coherence between internal structure and external stimulus. The illusion of fate strengthens because unconscious patterns do not operate through gradual reasoning. They operate through immediate resonance. A certain look, emotional tone, vulnerability, or confidence in another person can instantly activate stored emotional material. This activation produces a surge of meaning, as if something larger than coincidence is unfolding. But what is actually unfolding is psychological correspondence, not external design. The idea of fate also emerges because the unconscious seeks narrative completion. It does not store experiences as isolated fragments. It organizes them into evolving emotional stories. When a new person appears who fits into an unfinished emotional narrative, the mind experiences a sense of continuation, as if the story has found its next chapter. This continuity is interpreted as destiny because it feels purposeful and directional. However, these patterns often attract repetition rather than resolution at first. The same emotional dynamics can reappear in different forms until awareness enters the process. Without awareness, the individual may believe they are meeting the one, when they are actually encountering a familiar psychological configuration in a new external shape. The intensity comes from recognition of pattern, not uniqueness of person. The feeling of fate becomes strongest when both individuals unconsciously reinforce each other's unresolved material. One person's behavior may activate longing, while the other's response amplifies attachment. This mutual activation creates a closed loop that feels highly meaningful and self-confirming. Only when reflection enters does the experience shift. What once felt like external destiny begins to appear as internal alignment of two psychological systems. The sense of fate does not disappear, but it becomes understood as the mind's way of giving narrative form to deep unconscious recognition rather than evidence of predetermined external orchestration. The idea that the soul prefers healing over comfort can be understood as the psyche's tendency to move toward integration rather than stagnation, even when that movement feels disruptive. Comfort, in psychological terms, is not always synonymous with well-being. It often refers to familiarity, predictability, and the repetition of known emotional states. Healing, on the other hand, requires disruption of those patterns, because it involves bringing unconscious material into awareness and reorganizing it in a more complete form. When someone encounters a connection that feels emotionally intense or destabilizing, the conscious mind may interpret it as discomfort and attempt to reject it in favor of stability. However, the deeper psyche may be responding to the situation differently. It may recognize that this disruption is activating something previously unprocessed or split off from awareness. In this sense, what feels uncomfortable on the surface can carry the potential for inner expansion. The movement toward healing often begins with tension. Old emotional defenses are challenged, habitual responses are questioned, and familiar identities are destabilized. This creates inner friction because the system that maintained psychological stability is being asked to reorganize itself. The conscious self experiences this as uncertainty or emotional risk, while the deeper layers interpret it as necessary reconfiguration. Comfort tends to preserve existing structures, even when those structures are incomplete or limiting. It keeps emotional patterns intact because they are known and therefore predictable. But predictability does not guarantee psychological wholeness. In fact, long-term attachment to comfort can reinforce fragmentation by avoiding the very experiences that would integrate missing aspects of the self. Healing becomes visible when a person is drawn toward situations that challenge their internal limits. These situations often involve emotional intensity, vulnerability, or relational complexity that cannot be resolved through avoidance. Instead, they require reflection, adaptation, and inner honesty. This is why certain relationships feel both compelling and unsettling at the same time. They press against the boundaries of what the psyche has previously been willing to acknowledge. The idea of a deeper guiding principle can be understood as the psyche's intrinsic drive toward wholeness. This drive does not prioritize ease but completeness. It repeatedly brings individuals into experiences that expose imbalance so that integration becomes possible. Even when a person resists this process, the pattern tends to reappear in different forms until it is consciously engaged. In this way, healing is not a comfortable state but a directional movement. It often begins in disruption, passes through confusion, and gradually leads toward greater internal alignment. What initially feels like emotional disturbance can, over time, reveal itself as the restructuring needed for a more integrated sense of self. What is often called love at first sight or deep connection in its earliest form is usually not harmony, but disruption that pushes hidden parts of the self into awareness. The psyche does not evolve through comfort alone. It evolves when internal contradictions become impossible to ignore. When two people meet and create strong emotional activation, what is happening is often not immediate harmony between two complete selves, but the surfacing of unfinished inner material that has been waiting for expression. The idea that deep love begins as disturbance can be understood through how the mind maintains balance. Each person carries internal structures that regulate identity, emotion, and attachment. These structures are built over time to create stability. When someone enters who does not fit neatly into those structures, the system becomes unsettled. This unsettlement is experienced consciously as confusion, intensity, obsession, or emotional unpredictability. But beneath that reaction, something deeper is occurring. Rigid patterns are being loosened. This disturbance is not random. It is often precisely shaped to activate areas of the psyche that have been ignored or underdeveloped. A person who has become emotionally closed may encounter someone who triggers vulnerability. A person who avoids depth may encounter someone who forces emotional reflection. In this way, the disturbance acts like a catalyst, exposing what was previously contained beneath awareness. Because humans tend to associate love with peace and compatibility, this early turbulence is often misinterpreted as a sign that something is wrong. But in many cases, it is simply the initial phase of psychological contact between two complex systems. Before integration can occur, separation between old identity structures must be experienced first. That separation feels like instability, even when it is actually the beginning of transformation. Over time, if the connection is conscious and not driven purely by projection or avoidance, the disturbance begins to organize itself into understanding. Emotional intensity becomes less chaotic and more meaningful. The initial shock gives way to recognition of patterns both within oneself and in the other person. What once felt like emotional confusion starts to reveal its structure. The key point is that harmony is often the result, not the starting condition. Deep connection rarely begins in equilibrium because equilibrium implies no change is needed. Instead, meaningful connection tends to begin where inner imbalance becomes visible. That visibility creates tension, and that tension initiates movement toward integration. In this sense, disturbance is not the opposite of love, but often the first signal that something within the psyche is being reorganized toward a more complete form. In the end, what appears as coincidence in love is often the meeting point of unseen inner patterns trying to become conscious. Age, timing, and circumstance are only the surface language of something deeper happening beneath awareness. The mind tries to explain these connections through logic, but the psyche speaks through symbols, emotions, and recognition that cannot be easily measured. When a connection feels unusually intense, confusing, or even disruptive, it is not always a sign to escape it, nor is it automatically a sign to surrender to it. It is a moment of reflection. It asks whether what is being felt belongs to the actual person in front of you, or to something within you that has been waiting to be acknowledged. Sometimes love becomes the mirror through which hidden parts of the self are revealed, not as fantasy, but as invitation toward inner clarity. What is called fate may simply be the language the mind uses when it encounters deep internal alignment or unresolved emotional repetition. And what is called disturbance may be the beginning of psychological transformation. Not every intense connection is meant to last in form, but every meaningful one carries the potential to reveal something important about the inner world. Real understanding begins when the focus shifts from "why is this happening to me?" to "what is this showing me about myself?" From that point, relationships are no longer just external events, but part of a larger process of becoming more whole. And in that awareness, love is no longer reduced to age, timing, or prediction. It becomes a space where the unconscious is gently brought into light, where inner fragmentation is seen more clearly, and where growth becomes possible not through perfection, but through recognition.